Welcome. I'm going to start a new short series here today talking about a particular Greek word, dikaiosune. I was reading a book recently by a theologian, and she said every Christian layman knows the word agape. And he knows how when the New Testament talks about love, it doesn't just mean the love the way we would think about it. It usually means agape love. And we understand the significance of how agape is different than just regular versions of love. But there's a word in the New Testament which is dikaiosune. And she says she wishes every layman in the Christian church understood dikaiosune as clearly as we understood agape, as we understand agape. She says it's such an important Greek word, such an important word to understand the nuances of, and it's translated usually as righteousness in the New Testament, but it's sometimes translated as justice. And in either case, that translation doesn't quite do it justice. It doesn't quite mean all the things that dikaiosune probably really means. And so I want to spend a few weeks looking at this. I'm not a Greek scholar. I'm taking her word for it. Well, not only that, I've looked up a lot of other stuff and made sure that other people agree, and they do for the most part. So I want to take we're going to do a word study in the New Testament on dikaiosune. So starting next week, we're going to start walking through every place this is used in the New Testament and taking a look at it and seeing what flavors of and what extra nuance we can get from this word, because it's so important. But what I want to do today is give you all sort of the background, tell you what it does mean, and how else it might be translated. Sort of show you all the different aspects of what dikaiosune means. So it's the word for righteousness. It's the word translated righteousness and justice. Same word in the Greek, translated as both righteousness and justice in all these different places. And I want to investigate this a little bit. So let's start today. There's two verses I want to sort of hinge the question on. I want to show you two verses that use the word righteousness and point out to you that they're a little confusing. The first one is Matthew 6:33. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. Now, I know what it means to seek the kingdom of God. Jesus came, he announced the kingdom, we're sharing the gospel. By how we share the gospel and how we demonstrate the love of Christ and how we show the nature of Christ to people around us, by the ways that we draw people to the gospel and draw people to salvation, we are seeking his kingdom. And by the way that we live under his rule and let him be king in our lives, we are seeking his kingdom. But seeking his righteousness, well, it doesn't sound too hard. It sounds like that probably, if I hadn't really thought about it very much, I guess I always sort of assumed that meant try to be free from sin, try to live righteously. But it means more than that. And that's what I want to sort of get you thinking about. What are we doing when we seek his righteousness? And it's even stronger, that question is even sharper in the next verse, which is from Romans 6. He says, present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness to God. Could even be translated, your members as weapons of righteousness to God. What he's saying is, you're a new person now. Don't use your body for the old stuff. Use your body for the new things. The new things are to let your body be weapons of righteousness, instruments of righteousness for God. So if righteousness just means staying free from sin, which is sort of the way I tend to think of it, then it doesn't need weapons. It doesn't need instruments. This sort of implies that there's some sort of a fight or some sort of a work that we're doing for righteousness. Sometimes people talk about standing up for righteousness. I'm not fond of that phrase, but I think what it's getting at is the same question I'm raising here. So maybe it's a good phrase if it's taken the right way. It's saying that there seems to be work for us to do as far as righteousness is concerned, something for us to seek, something for us to let ourselves be weapons and instruments of. So I'd like to think a little bit about what that means and sort of pose that as one of the underlying questions that I have in mind here. Okay. Let's talk about dikaiosune. This is the Greek word. If you just sort of work that out letter by letter, it's like this. It's pronounced dikaiosune. More or less. You don't have it quite right, something like that. It's just one word among many. There are many other forms of the same word. Oh, here, it's G1343. For anybody who knows what that means, it has a Strong's number, meaning if you're looking this up in a concordance, you look up G1343, and that's this word. Okay, there are several other related words that are other grammatical forms of it. This is called a word family sometimes. And so from G1341 up to G1349, you can see all these different words that are related to this. 1343 is dikaiosune, righteousness, but dikaiokresia, I'm probably going to mispronounce a lot of these, is righteous judgment. And dikaios is just simply righteous or just. And dikaiao is to justify or to pronounce righteous. And dikaioma is righteous deed or regulation or requirement. And dikaios is righteously or justly. And dikaiosis is justification. And dikastes is a judge or an arbitrator. And dike is justice or vengeance or punishment. All right, so all these are related words. They're just all forms of the same thing. Righteous, right, rightly, righteously, righteousness, or just, justly, and justify, justification, and so on. What I want to point out to you is that sometimes it makes sense to, I guess what I'm saying is, notice that there's a bunch of words that are related to right and a bunch of words that are related to just. That's reflecting the fact that when we translate this Greek word, we sort of are a little bit split on it. Some of the verses translate it as righteousness and focus on that meaning, and some translate it as justice and focus on that meaning. Google AI answered something for me about this. They called this the linguistic split. They said English is a hybrid Germanic Romance language. When translating the DK family, translators must choose between Germanic words, Germanic roots like right and righteous and righteousness, and Latin or Romance roots like just or justice and justify. This introduces a conceptual split into English Bibles that does not exist in the Greek text. What they're saying is, when it's translated, we tend to choose either the righteousness concept or the justice concept. But dikaiosune is not two different concepts. It's one concept which is right in the middle between those two things. It's not exactly righteousness. It's not exactly justice. It's something that's settling between righteousness and justice. And so we'll talk about that a little bit as we go. It's hard for me to think of there being a word between righteousness and justice. I keep trying to think of dikaiosune as meaning two different things. But I think that's just because I don't have a good English word most of the time. I will suggest one in a while, but I don't have a good English word for this thing in between the two. And so the words we have in our language affect how we think. They affect the categories we use in our thought. And because we don't have a good category for this word, at least not an easy one, an easily findable one, it's easy for us to just not have a good handle on this. So this is what I want to really sort of do in the next few weeks, is to flesh out the full meaning of this thing so that we can have a more accurately targeted understanding of what dikaiosune is talking about. Okay, so let's just think about righteousness and justice in English. When you translate something as righteousness, what does that make you think of? This is Webster's. Webster says that righteousness is the quality or state of being righteous. Not very helpful. Conformity to the divine or moral law. So it's this idea that there's certain rules we have to follow, and if we follow them and don't sin, we're righteous. If we do sin, we're unrighteous. So it's the quality or state of being in conformity to the laws, to God's laws or to moral laws. Justice, on the other hand, Webster says, is the process or result of using laws to fairly judge cases, redress wrongs, and punish crimes. So this is a very different focus. It's focusing on judging things in a positive way, on making decisions about who's right or wrong and what punishments there should be and what rewards perhaps there should be, and to address disputes. That's a very different picture. And so to say somebody is righteous and to say somebody is just, they should go together, but they're not exactly the same thing. So I just started thinking about the ways that these are a little different for us in English. We notice that English tends to use righteousness to think of it as a state, a way of being. And so it makes it sort of passive. It's about who you are, and you are a righteous person. But justice is the process, it says. It's more about an action, what you do. So being just says something about being just implies something about what your activities are, what you're involved in. Being righteous implies something about who you are and what you don't get involved in, perhaps, and the sort of your integrity. Righteousness tends to be more individual. I said righteousness is more about me and justice more about others. And I don't mean that about me in a bad way. Righteousness is something that my primary concern is, am I doing the right thing? Am I what I'm supposed to be? Am I in God's will? Am I in sin, or am I in God's will, or am I doing what's holy? And justice is more about my relationship to other people. Similarly, righteousness seems to be about being judged, Being righteous means that when the judge looks at my life, he says, you are in the right. But justice seems to be about me judging other people or taking action to make sure that things are right between other people. And righteousness seems to be more about conformity to God and his laws and the moral law. And justice seems to be more about human relationships. Now, none of these things are absolutely definite. For us in English as well, righteousness and justice kind of merge. To be just is to be right, and to be right is to be just in a certain sense and to some degree. But we do really have two different sets of connotations for these things. So dikaiosune is right in between these two. It's partly the righteousness idea and partly the justice idea, or at least there's more to it than that too. But it is kind of in between these two, which is why it gets translated sometimes in one way, sometimes in another. All right, let's talk about what this middle thing could mean, but to do that, I want to also think about righteousness and justice in the Old Testament. So the New Testament writers were steeped in Old Testament understanding. Paul, when he writes, he knows all about the Old Testament, and he was brought up on it. He thinks very much in terms of it. And so when they were talking about dikaiosune and other kinds of things, they were steeped in the Old Testament understanding of righteousness and justice. And that's also a little different than what we think of in English today. So there are two important words here that I want to look at in the Old Testament. One is the word mishpat, which is the word which is usually translated as justice in the King James, and in New American Standard, which is what I read. The definition of mishpat, it says here, the resource I looked up says the definition is judgment or ordinance or law or justice, and it's often translated as justice. Context, it says it generally refers to retributive justice, that is, giving people what they deserve. They get retribution, whether good or bad. Executing fairness, to make sure that the same laws apply to everybody and there's no bias or anything. Delivering individuals from oppressors, that's important to remember, because we normally don't I don't always think to put that in when I think about justice, but these days there is a lot more emphasis in some groups of people in some political sides of the aisle about social justice and make sure that people are delivered from their oppressors. That's a biblical idea. Justice mishpat included in delivering individuals from oppressors and ensuring right order and governance, make sure the law is respected and honored, and that they are good laws, that the laws are suitable and keep people from taking advantage of other people. It's all about having the right kind of system to keep people from taking advantage of each other, to keep people if you don't have justice, you just have might makes right. And whoever's most powerful gets whatever they want, and other people get downtrodden, get hurt in the process. But justice, if it's set up in a society, keeps the whole society keeps the whole society running in a way which gives respect and honor to each individual and protects people from being abused by other people who have more power than they do. And this is sort of the idea here. So justice is retributive justice, punishment and reward, fairness, delivering individuals from oppression, ensuring right order and governance. And that was usually translated as justice in the King James. Now, something to say about that. Notice what I said. Justice in the Old Testament is not just concerned with individual integrity, but also with social justice, especially for rulers. Now, not only social justice, but also individual integrity. In other words, a just person, a just king, for example, in the Old Testament, meant on the one hand that he himself personally followed the laws and was honest and had integrity and was not a hypocrite or did not abuse his power. He followed God's laws, and he looked to the laws that God had set up, and he saw himself as a steward of God's justice. And so he tried to impose justice on his society, but that would lead to social justice, to the idea that he wanted to make sure that the whole society was dealing correctly with, reaching out to and lifting up those who were oppressed or poor or downtrodden in some way, and making sure that they also got the rights they should be able to have. So here's some examples to show that. Proverbs 31. Proverbs 31 is advice to a young man who's going to be king, Lemuel. And it says, King Lemuel, here's what you should know as a king. And in verses 8 and 9, it says this, as king, open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate. Open your mouth, judge righteously, and defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. This is what your job is as a king, it's saying, Lemuel. You need to notice those people who cannot speak up for themselves. And you need to open your mouth for them. For the rights of all the unfortunate, open your mouth, judge righteously, defend the rights of the afflicted and needy. It's interesting, both political sides in the U.S. emphasize this. They just emphasize it for different people. The liberals would be more concerned about the rights of immigrants or the rights of minorities. And conservatives may be more concerned, for example, for the rights of those in the womb, or for other kinds of rights involved as well. But both sides are right that we should open our mouth for the mute. We should speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves. We should be the voice for those who are voiceless, or at least kings should. And I think every one of us who has some measure of authority should, where our authority extends. As a professor, I need to make sure that I am dealing justly with my students, and I also need to watch out for places, if in my classes, if one of the students is really bullying another, I need to stop it. Say, that doesn't happen in my class. This is not what's going to happen. As a father, I have a certain responsibility to notice those who need my help within our family, as when my kids are young, for example. So there's this idea that being a leader, being a ruler, wherever we have authority, wherever we have the power to do something about it, we need to use that power to help those who are powerless. Here's another passage from the New Testament, but it shows the same idea, that the role of a judge or a ruler or a king was that they needed to take action to help those who needed their help. Jesus tells this parable. Now, this is mainly about prayer and about the second coming, but in the means of telling it, he uses an example of a judge who's unjust. He was telling them a parable to show that at all times they ought to pray and not to lose heart. That's the main point. Saying, in a certain city, there was a judge who did not fear God and did not respect man. Now, as we go ahead, watch what makes this judge a bad judge. There was a widow in that city. She would have had no husband to support her in that culture, and she would have needed somebody. And she kept coming to him saying, "Give me legal protection from my opponent." For a while he was unwilling, but afterward he said to himself, "Even though I do not fear God or respect man, yet because this widow bothers me, I'll give her legal protection. Otherwise, by continually coming, she will wear me out." His point is, if the judge had feared God and had respected man, he would have given the woman legal protection. He would have said, "This is exactly what I'm here to do, to help this woman get legal protection against her opponent." And the Lord said, "Hear what the unrighteous judge said. Now will not God bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night, and will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will bring about justice for them quickly." So what he's saying is, God is just. God responds to us when we have needs and are oppressed or hurting or have no power. He acts on our behalf. And this judge, again, had kind of a stewardship from God to act the same way with his widow, and it was foolish and unrighteous of him not to do that. Second word that I want to look at in the Old Testament, and then we'll come back to the New, is the word tzedakah, which is the word often translated as righteousness. The definition says here is righteousness, justice, or rightness. Notice the context. In Jewish tradition, it specifically refers to the religious obligation of charity, performing acts of righteousness and giving to the poor. Often translated in the KJV as righteousness. So this is interesting and different than I expected when I first started studying it a couple decades ago. I thought righteousness would all be about not sinning. But it turns out a lot of righteousness in the Old Testament is about charity. It's about giving to the poor. It's about generosity and compassion for other people. Justice in the Old Testament, I should have said righteous. This is already what we had. Justice is concerned partly with social justice. Mercy and generosity were considered religious duties for a righteous person. Mercy wasn't just an optional. It was part of what it was to be righteous. And I want to just show you some Old Testament verses to support that. Here's Job 31. Job, in this chapter, goes through and tries to explain why he is righteous. He has not sinned. It's not that God is punishing him for his sin. And in the first 15 verses, he talks about the different kinds of sins he hasn't committed and why he's righteous there. And then he gets to this part, and he tells why he's righteous in terms of his generosity to the poor. He says, "If I've kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail," it means she's looking with longing for what she needs, but it never comes. "Or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it. If I've had what I needed and haven't shared it with those who didn't need it. But from my youth, that orphan grew up with me as a father, and from infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, If I've lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket and let my arm be broken off at the elbow. He's saying, I have been faithful and righteous. I have helped those who needed my help, those who were poor, those who had no support within their around them, those who were orphans or widows, those who lacked clothing or didn't have what they needed to eat. I would take care of them. And that's how he lays his claim to being a righteous person. I just want to point out to you how there's just this assumption that to be righteous is to be generous and compassionate and giving away what you've got. Isaiah 58, God says to Israel, you're fasting, but you're not doing the right things when you fast. He says, I don't choose a fast where you just do these religious ceremonies and then live selfishly. He says, is this not the fast which I choose? To loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into the house when you see the naked to cover him and not to hide yourself from your own flesh? Then your light will break out like the dawn and your recovery will speedily spring forth and your righteousness will go before you. The glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you'll call and the Lord will answer. You'll cry and he will say, here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and speaking wickedness, that's the one thing, have integrity, don't oppress others. And also, if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the desire of the afflicted, that's the other, you give yourself in generosity, then your light will rise in darkness and your gloom will become like midday. Again, the Old Testament sort of assumes that part of being righteous is that you give to those who need it, that you look for ways to be generous to those who are hurting. And then even in the New Testament, we see this. Remember the parable of the sheep and the goats. Jesus says at the last day, he'll stand and the nations will be gathered before him and he'll turn to the sheep. And the king, it says, the king will say to those on his right, come, you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. Naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. Then the righteous, notice they're characterized as the righteous, will answer him. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to eat? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and come to you? The king will answer and say to them, truly I say to you, to the extent you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even the least of them, you did it to me. So again, there's this idea that part of our obligation as people of righteousness is to give generously to others. So in the Greek version of the Old Testament, the second word, particularly for righteousness, in the Septuagint, that word, tzedakah, is consistently translated as dikaiosune. So in the New Testament, part of the idea that Paul has in mind or others have in mind when they use the word dikaiosune, or when Jesus does, they're partly drawing on what Jewish hearers would have immediately connected with Old Testament verses about tzedakah, verses about righteousness and generosity and mercy. And love and compassion. This shouldn't be a surprise to us. It's basically saying that people were supposed to love God and love others, right? And do something about it. This is talking about the loving others component. That's partly what's going on here. Okay, that's all the Old Testament background. One more piece of Old Testament background, and this is really important because this is something that the Jewish readers would have understood, but we, again, wouldn't have necessarily gotten right away. The word tzedakah was not merely, it says, as it says here, it's not an abstract moral ideal or a blind legal standard. It represents faithfulness to a relationship. It was a relationship word. So tzedakah wasn't just that there's these rules that I follow, so I am righteous. There's this God that I serve, so I'm righteous because I'm following him. It's a part of our relationship with God. It's not a religion, it's a relationship, people sometimes say. That's what's going on here. It's about loving God, and therefore we love other people. Loving God, and therefore we love the ones he loves. Therefore we want to act like him. He is righteous and good and gracious and merciful, and so we want to be righteous and good and gracious and merciful. And so in the same way, in the New Testament, when God acts in righteousness, in dikaiosune, he's acting to fulfill his covenant promises. He's acting to deliver his people. He's acting to put a broken world back into proper order. And so let's move on. Righteousness, but righteousness thus means for us coming back to a proper relationship with God. It means being right with God. It's a relational thing. It means, I think one way of thinking about this is that it means my being righteous in practice means not just that I don't fall into certain sins. It means that I am fully and courageously doing what I'm created to do and being the person I'm created to be, no more and no less. God has the whole universe filled with all these different pieces of it, rocks and trees and sunsets and different people, and every person has their part to play. Every rock and tree and sunset has its part to play in the beauty of the whole. And we humans have refused to play our part. We've resisted what God's call for us was. We've tried to be something else. We're like notes in a symphony that are trying to sound the wrong notes. Righteousness means coming back into line with what God's design for me is, coming back into line with where God has me and saying, I want to fully and courageously be and do what you call me to be and do. Ephesians 2:10, we are his workmanship, created for good works in Christ Jesus, which he has prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So back to dikaiosune in the New Testament. One word that I've read that people suggest for this middle ground is the word rectification. This is a very good word for this. It's very much what dikaiosune means from my understanding. The problem is most people don't know what rectification means, so this doesn't help either. Rectification in the dictionary says to set right or remedy or to correct by removing errors. Correct, rectification, to adjust. So think about the word rect. It means right. Rectangle is something with right angles. To correct something is to make it correspond with what is right. Rectification is to take something that has gone wrong or got an error in and to fix it and make it right. And the idea is that God's righteousness, is not merely a state of God. It's not merely just an adjective. It's almost like a verb. It's God's action. It's God's work. It's that God is actively at work making the world right again. Now, he's righteous also as a state completely. It's part of his character. But his character is such that he takes action. The world has gone wrong because of Satan, because of sin, because of people. And it's vastly different from what God had created for it. But God isn't just saying, do better. He's taken the initiative. He's set up a plan of salvation. He sent Jesus, who's gone to the cross and died and risen again. And he's now at work through us, through the Holy Spirit and through the gospel. And he will one day come back and set everything right. God is in the process of taking a broken world and fixing it. He's in the process of taking a lost world and finding it. He's in the process of rectifying things, of fixing things. That's what the word dikaiosune is talking about. The righteousness of God is the right-making activity of God. And this is what I'm going to emphasize in the next few weeks. The righteousness of God is the right-making activity and work of God based on who he is and based on his character in the world around us. So one of the ideas behind here is that there's kind of a cosmic scope to God's right-making activity. Satan and sin and death, capital S, capital D, are cosmic powers at work to destroy and corrupt God's perfect design for the cosmos. But God is actively at work undoing the damage, making things right again. And it's not an even battle. God wins every time. But he's moving slowly in history, and we don't see it all yet. It's not all made right yet, but it's going to be made right. So this will include both judgment and redemption. Judgment is part of making wrongs right, and redemption is part of making wrongs right. And they're both part of his ongoing righteousness. So there's a whole bunch of verses you should look up if you want to see the cosmic scope of this. I'm not going to read them. Romans 8:18-25, 1 Corinthians 15:20-28, Colossians 1:16-20 are some verses that bring that out. So let's return to the two verses we had at the beginning, plus one more. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. God's work of making things right is what Jesus is saying. God is bringing his kingdom. You be part of that. You seek that. He's doing a work of making everything right again, judging what's wrong and redeeming and pardoning those who are repentant and bringing them into righteousness. That's what God is up to. You seek the same thing. You seek to be part of and participating in that work. First of all, by getting right with God yourself, or more accurately, letting God make you right with him. It's God's work. More accurately, so first of all, you get right with God, with me, by trusting the gospel, by believing in my forgiveness. And then you be part of that work to set the world right by sharing the gospel and by demonstrating my love and by demonstrating my power, he's saying. Romans 6:13, present yourselves to God as those alive from the dead. And now that we are alive and forgiven and cleansed from our sins, present your members, the members of your body, as weapons or instruments of righteousness, of the right-making activity of God. and present yourself to God. It's like Isaiah 6. Isaiah had this vision of God, and then he said, "Woe is me, I'm so full of sin." And in the vision, an angel flew to him and touched his lips with the tongue and purified him. And then God said, "I need somebody to go for me." And Isaiah said, "Send me. Now that you've cleansed me, I want to go and share with others whatever you want to say to them." So we are to present ourselves to God as those alive from the dead and become part of his right-making work within the world. Now, I did want to put one more verse on here. This is not the word dikaiosune, but it's the word dikaiao. I can never say it. Anyway, it's the word which means to make right. We have been justified by faith. I wanted to throw this in because I want to make sure. I do think righteousness, we'll talk about this in the next several weeks, is about participating in the activity of God. It's about the way we live and the things we do. But it's all founded on the fact that God has already declared us righteous. We have been made righteous by faith, just by God's declaration. He's made us just, he's made us righteous, and that has nothing to do with our performance, nothing to do with our works. We're saved before our works get into motion. But because of the salvation God has brought to us, because of our justification by faith, we now become those who present ourselves to God and our members as weapons of righteousness. And we begin to live in what the scripture calls the way of righteousness. We begin to be a part of God's right-making activity within the world through our representation of the gospel and of the love of Christ and the power of God and the various things that we want to show people about our great God and our great salvation. Okay, I'm going to go through these same concepts over and over again in several different verses in the next several weeks. I hope you will find this as challenging and exciting as I have been finding it. I think it's really cool to see this. Out of all the complications I went into, just remember one idea. The righteousness of God is active. It's making things right, not just a state of being right, but it's actually also making the world, changing the world through the gospel. We're waiting for God to do that, but we are participating with him in that great work. Okay, see you next week.